Hi there everyone, Lars here from Camille's Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers. Because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And today I come to you with my last review and analysis video for The Rings of Power Season 1. And there is a ton to get to here in this video. So I've just got a couple of things to say in this introduction before I dive into the usual spoilery overview, looking at what the lore inaccuracies are for this episode, as well as why Tolkien wrote what he did, looking at the show from a completely unbiased perspective as though Tolkien had never existed, had never written the Lord of the Rings, and then finally, of course, the writing advice for all of you fantastic authors and creatives out there. So the first thing that I want to say is that while I would love to be done with the Rings of Power, I honestly, genuinely feel like there are still some things that I need to say about it in terms of what authors can learn from this series. Some things that I think genuinely need to be discussed because they're so crucial to the writing process that I think it will really benefit other novice authors. So I will have one more video that goes over, I think, the most important lessons that people can learn from, quite honestly, the overall failure of the Rings of Power. And of course, the second thing that I want to give are my recommendations for other stories that you can enjoy rather than spending your time with this garbage that we call the Rings of Power. Yeah, I know, my bias is definitely showing through here at the beginning of this video, but I'll be honest, after having had a look at the latest episode, looking back at the season, and looking at the recent stuff that's been coming out from the showrunners, it is clear that this entire series is just falling apart. It's a disaster. When the showrunners have to come out and say, well, okay, next season will be more canonical because it should be, rather than saying, we understand, we've heard you guys that this show has been really bad, that you Tolkien fans haven't enjoyed it, so we're going to go back to the books for real this time. No, they're still lying to us. And it's just absolutely mind-boggling how they continue to hurl horrible things at their critics and at people who should be their fans. They're continuing to be divisive. This is just awful right here. As someone who loves fantasy, as someone who loves the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, as someone who came into this wanting this show to succeed, and if you don't believe me, you can go back to my earliest video talking about the Rings of Power. I wanted this to succeed because I want fantasy and Tolkien to succeed and kick off a whole new era of awesome televised fantasy. But that's probably not what we're going to get after this colossal flop. And on top of that, they're just diving right already into season 2 and filming it. No, they're not writing new scripts. They're taking whatever they wrote like a year or two ago, and they're running with that because they feel like they are not beholden to their audience. They just want to make their story for themselves. And oh boy, that's stuff that I'm definitely going to address when I look at the major lessons that we as creatives and as authors can learn from the Rings of Power. So I'll get more into that. But for now, let's focus on 5 way better stories that you can be spending your time with. Alright, so for my first big recommendation for this video, if you want excellent fantasy, and I do mean excellent fantasy that is huge and that also does everything that the Rings of Power promised but didn't deliver on, with a wide sweeping world, with multiple character arcs, with multiple main characters who are doing incredible things that all lead to some grand revelation of what's really happening in the world. And you want to know what? It even matches up all of the different timelines. Read the Stormlight Archive from Brandon Sanderson Senpai. Absolutely. I know these books are massive, they're huge, but the story is absolutely worth it. The Stormlight Archive, I feel that as it gets more and more recognition from people will stop talking about Game of Thrones so much and probably start talking about the Stormlight Archive, especially since it's getting some adaptations some few years from now. Mistborn is going to be adapted first, but once the Stormlight Archive is adapted either for the big screen or for television, it is going to be massive. check this series out. It is so good. If I were to try to get into the plot right now and the different characters, we would be here for hours. It is absolutely worth it. And for my second recommendation, kind of thinking a little bit about Game of Thrones, if you're looking for dark fantasy, I would highly recommend Goblin Slayer, especially if you are a fan of Dungeons & Dragons. This story is honestly really cool. I know it gets a lot of flack for its violence and other themes, but if you're someone who's into dark fantasy, well, already that's kind of a bit up your alley, isn't it? Goblin Slayer is a great story about a guy who is obsessed with killing goblins. It's pretty straightforward. However, the story itself does a wonderful job of bringing in various D&D elements, as well as just telling a fantastic story for a sweeping world with multiple races, guilds, plots, villains, heroes, and really the story of one man who isn't really that important in the grand scheme of things, stitches all of these things together in a way that just feels incredibly believable and is highly engaging. So, Goblin Slayer absolutely gets a recommendation from me. And because this is Halloween time, if you want a fun, spooky story and one that is also pretty hilarious, I highly recommend Murder on the Moor by Camille's Harem. We'll actually have a link for that down in the description below, and I'll just give a brief explanation for what led to this story. In Camille's Harem, we have something called Writer's Roulette, where one person starts writing one page, hands it off to the next person writes that page, only using what came the page before. So by the time that you pass it off to the third person can only write the story based off of what they read on the second page. Murder on the Moor was our attempt at writing a murder mystery story with some great spooky elements when no one knew really what was going on. And the results are honestly hilarious. We have a link to our epic recording of it, which we did with our fellow YouTuber Zaza. It is awesome. Please check it out. It is hilarious, and it definitely fits within the spirit of Halloween. My fourth recommendation for you to check out is the story Kono Oto Tomare, and I hopefully didn't pronounce that too badly. This is a really great story about a delinquent and his bullied friend. It's kind of really hard to say at the beginning exactly what the relationship for these two characters are supposed to be, but it's basically about these two outcasts in a Japanese school joining up in a specific music club. And oh my gosh, if you want a story that just gives you all the good feels, this is it. There is an anime adaptation for it, but I highly recommend checking out the manga because it is beautiful. Not only is it beautifully drawn, but the characters themselves just come to life on the page. And even the side characters get their own moments to shine and get incredible character arcs. It is really worth the read. And for my fifth and final recommendation, I'm going to recommend Stardust by Neil Gaiman. And I'm actually going to give you a suggestion if you haven't read if you haven't read the book or watched the movie. If you haven't read the movie or watched the book, let's go with that. If you haven't read the movie or watched the book, I highly recommend that you start with the movie first. And the reason for that is because the movie is a fantastic adaptation of the book, but it actually does things very differently, especially in its final act. It's very different from the book. But the book also tells a very satisfying story. Usually what happens is that people, when they read the book, they want the movie to be similar to the way that the book was, and if the movie doesn't match that expectation, it kind of diminishes the enjoyment that someone can have for the movie. In the case of Stardust, I will say this, in my personal opinion, and also actually from the opinions of all the people who suggested the movie and the book to me, it was this: watch the movie, enjoy the movie, and then read the book, and then enjoy the book for what it is. Because they both tell, while albeit very similar stories, they tell them in a different way. And it's honestly something that you have to experience for yourself. It goes to show that adaptations can be different from their source material, but still be really good. I haven't met anyone who dislikes the Stardust movie, and even people who have read Neil Gaiman's book also really enjoy the movie. So if you want to restore your faith in adaptations that are good and not just for the Lord of the Rings, please check out Neil Gaiman's Stardust. Again, watch the movie first or read the movie first, whichever you prefer, and then go and hit the book. All right, so with those recommendations out of the way, let's get into the spoilery overview for the finale to the Rings of Power. I'm going to start off with the arc within this episode that really had the least amount of time and really meant the least in this overall story. And that is the King of Numenor dying and Elendil's daughter being hired to sketch him for purposes to build a statue or to create a beautiful painting of him, to immortalize him, whatever. The people wish to remember the king. And Elendil's daughter has been hired for the job. Congratulations to her. Meanwhile, Elendil sails back with the queen. The queen is fearful of what will happen when she gets back. However, she is also still proud. It's nice to see some conflict with the queen, how she's going to deal with things when she gets back. Meanwhile, our Farazan is beginning to plot his bigger moves now that the king has passed away. So at least we're getting some setup for the eventual overthrow of the queen and our Farazan taking over the throne. So that's nice to see. But there were only 3 very short scenes, actually 4 very short scenes to communicate all of this. And really, it could have been relegated back to the previous episode and they would not have felt out of place, kind of like they do here. The next little plot that we get is we finally have confirmation, or at least soft confirmation, that the Meteor Man is Gandalf. After being found by the cultists of Sauron who mistaken him for Sauron, so these people really aren't good cultists, or maybe they are, depending on your opinion of cults. They find Gandalf, they find the Meteor Man, they try to convince him that he's Sauron, they knock him out. Well, the hobbits quickly catch up with them, begin pelting them with rocks. These cultists, who apparently could wipe out an entire caravan with ease, now struggle with 4 little hobbits, rocks, and their own knives. And so they proceed to begin burning down the entire forest, which wakens up the Meteor Man, who then has a powerful magic duel with them and reveals them to be wraiths. They are like proto-ring wraiths, just as the Harfoots are supposed to be proto-hobbits. And Gandalf, once he gets a hold of the one cultist's staff with the Eye of Sauron, which is silly because Sauron hasn't yet assumed that form of an eye, but whatever, uses the staff, banishes the wraiths by turning them into ethereal moths, and the leader of these hobbits, Sadoc Burrows, has a knife hurled into his gut, and he dies while watching the sunrise. And I'm just going to say this, I'm going to say this right now, and I'm going to get to this later on when I talk about my analysis from an unbiased perspective. This was a touching moment, but it didn't land. And it didn't land because, well, for one thing, I had a hard time remembering that this guy's name was Sadoc Burrows, and he hasn't had much of a character arc. I'm going to get more into why that's an issue later on. But so that happens, and then the Meteor Man decides that he's going to follow the words of the cultists. He's going to go east to the land of Rhûn, and he's going to search out where the stars are strange to find his purpose. And Nori Brandyfoot is going to join him and abandon everyone else to go on this quest. And they leave with the Meteor Man appropriating Gandalf's line of always follow your nose. And that's something that I noticed a lot in this episode. This episode appropriated and reused so many lines from the books and from the Peter Jackson trilogy that it felt like a blatant ripoff. If I were grading this script as a teacher, I would say, I'm sorry, but you guys plagiarized so much to create this. And sure, you might have put some of it into your own words, but you plagiarized all of this stuff. Just because you made it 25% different doesn't necessarily make it your own. Well, in any case, Nori and softly confirmed Gandalf go off to the east. Meanwhile, things are going down back at Eregion. Galadriel has once again proven that the showrunners have no concept of time or distance by crossing half of Middle-earth in 6 days by horseback. and she's not writing Shadowfax. And she brings the dying Halbrand to the elves, who then heal him without realizing that he has a completely different physiology than really anyone else on Middle-earth. In any case, she goes and she meets with Gil-galad, with Celebrimbor, with Elrond, who are all freaking out that the elves are about to lose their lives. And yet we still have no confirmation other than a dying tree that this is actually happening to the elves. And they only have a small bit of mithril to work with, and they are arguing about what they should do with it. Celebrimbor wants to make a crown. It will eventually become a ring, then 3 rings at Galadriel's behest. And while all this is going on, Celebrimbor says something that reminds Galadriel of Adar, and it's only happened after he has spoken with Halbrand, who has magically gotten up out of his bed and is helping Celebrimbor to figure out how to forge his mighty saving device from Mithril. And what I will say is this before I get back to Galadriel: I did enjoy the chemistry between Halbrand and Celebrimbor. I actually could have sat back and watched an entire episode of these two just geeking out over basically magic and metal. The thing is that the showrunners didn't actually bother checking out real metallurgy or even figuring out how to properly forge magical metals, which, I mean, yes, it's a fantasy story, you can come up with whatever you want, but there are already stories like Full Metal Alchemist and even Mistborn that do a fantastic job of getting into the complexities of magic metals and how you mix and combine stuff in order to get really powerful stuff. This here was just a bunch of gobbledygook. However, I will write it up again to the fact that there's great chemistry between Halbrand and Celebrimbor that I didn't care. I was like, sweet, I'm enjoying this. I'm going to kick back and just listen to these guys. Well, Galadriel begins to grow suspicious of Halbrand after all this time with him, after manipulating him and using him. I guess he's lost his usefulness to her now, and so now she's going to start suspecting him. And so she has another elf who looks like he just walked off the set of Star Trek, and I know a lot of people have said that, but I'm just going to reiterate that. Go and check in on Halbrand. And isn't it just amazing that Galadriel, in her epic quest to find all of this stuff to lead to Sauron, has never bothered actually hitting the books herself, and all of this information just happens to be there, and yet no one even bothers actually checking it. Like, this is a world where there's massive amounts of information that people have basically at their fingertips. Their library is basically a better version of the internet, and yet no one bothers using any of this vast amount of knowledge to better themselves or to figure things out. No, and it just comes to Galadriel whenever she needs it. Again, a very Mary Sue moment. And the quick research, which is done within an hour, quickly reveals that Halbrand is an imposter. And so she confronts him, and Halbrand admits to being Sauron. And in a neat sequence of events, we see Sauron manipulating Galadriel. Now then, this does go back to, oh my gosh, I hate how Finrod was just done so dirty, because again, Finrod would never have told Galadriel at all, or told anyone to ever touch the darkness, because Finrod was just too good a man, too good of a soul to ever even suggest such a horrifying thing. Yet it fits for Galadriel, because Galadriel's like, oh, I must touch the darkness to know the light. Oh, it's so dumb. Well, then she is back on the raft with Halbrand, and there you get a pretty cool reveal sequence to Halbrand being Sauron, and you get to see a vision of Galadriel that is far more fuller, taller, and definitely communicates power. And again, they repurpose lines from Galadriel in the Fellowship of the Ring about what she would be like if she took the One Ring. That's what Sauron offers to her. And Sauron, I mean, he seems like he's got like a really great plan in mind. We're going to heal the world using the power that we can harness, the power of the unseen world, the power of the rings. We are going to bend the fate of Iluvatar himself to heal the world. And in order to ensure that this happens, well, we're going to need to have wise rulers, and who better to rule than a Maiar who has been there since the beginning. And he offers Galadriel a chance to heal and a chance to have everything that canonical Galadriel ever wanted. And in this case, it's not Galadriel rejecting Sauron because it's it's a deal with the devil, it's a monkey's paw, it's something that's false ultimately. She rejects him simply because she just hates Sauron. And that makes this moment actually just really silly, because when we get to see the entire history of Sauron and Galadriel, it makes it very clear that Galadriel made Sauron into the villain. And we'll get into this when I talk about the analysis, from the analysis perspective here, and also when I talk about the lore, but it's so silly. And I was rooting for Sauron this entire scene, because I'm like, yeah, I 100% side with this guy. I don't side with the hero. That is bad for a story. Well, Sauron magics his way on out of there, returns to Mordor to reclaim this land and to begin yoking the orcs to his will yet again. Meanwhile, Galadriel nearly shanks Elrond because she thinks that he is Sauron, and that's another just honestly ridiculous scene that just really didn't make any sense. Well, they go to meet Celebrimbor as he begins forging the rings, and Galadriel's like, no, we must have 3 rings in order to balance us out, because one will lead to rule. And I guess that kind of makes sense, because she has just spoken with Sauron, and she's like, 2 will divide us, 3 will balance us out. And I'll get more into that when I talk about the analysis. In any case, the rings are made 25% different from the rings that were in the Peter Jackson movie. Meanwhile, Elrond does a little bit of sleuthing about and finds out that Halbrand is not who he said he was, and that Galadriel's trying to cover it up. And it's honestly really scary to see that Galadriel is not sharing vital information with her friends and with her leaders in order to prevent them from falling into a potential trap that Sauron has made. She leads the elves into Sauron's trap, and she yokes their destiny to the rings, which will be controlled by the One Ring. Now then, unless she's read the script, she doesn't know that the One Ring is going to be forged, but she knows that Sauron was manipulating Celebrimbor and helping him to figure out how to forge the One Ring, or forge the 3 elven rings. Why would you support Celebrimbor then in this plan? I think she thinks that she can somehow beat Sauron by having 3 rings rather than 1 for him to claim and thus rule over the elves. But it still doesn't make much sense. Ultimately, by the end of this episode, we're left with the realization that Galadriel really is the villain of this entire story. She's the one who has orchestrated all of this suffering, and she's the one who has empowered the villain Sauron, and it's just a mess. Wow. Alright, with all of that stuff being said, let's get into the lore inaccuracies of this episode. Like I said earlier, this show is just basically robbed Tolkien's corpse for anything it thinks will make it look good and has stitched it in horribly. There really is nothing that is lore accurate within this episode. The closest that we get to it is that Sauron did at one point want to be good, so I will at least address this, though the episode absolutely gets the history of Sauron wrong when Sauron is giving his brief history to Galadriel. It almost makes it sound as though the first age was an age without the sun and the moon. No, it is the first age of the sun, because once the trees of Valinor have been destroyed, they were briefly revived in order to get their fruits to form the sun and the moon, which, yeah, I guess Celebrimbor was in a way correct about what he said, but then again, we don't really know. So, yeah. But Sauron has been around for a really long time, and he wasn't possessed by Morgoth, he had chosen to join Morgoth back when he was known as Melkor. And as we read, Sauron did many, many horrible things in Morgoth's name. He was Morgoth's chief lieutenant, and he was the one who had taken over the forces of darkness when Morgoth was captured and briefly thrown into the void by the Valar. However, at the end of the First Age, when Thangorodrim was destroyed and Beleriand was basically also destroyed in the results of the War of Wrath, Sauron did spend time on Middle-earth trying to atone for his sins and helping to rebuild as much as he could. He was basically on parole by the Valar, and it was told him that he would have to make an accounting for what he had done, that he would have to face judgment for all of his sins. Now, Sauron was afraid of that. He didn't really believe in the clemency or the mercy of the Valar. He was scared of them, so he did everything he could to make Middle-earth better. But when the Valar said, hey, it's time for you to come back to Valinor, Sauron fled, and he hid himself in the darkest places of Middle-earth and began to plot his revenge. This is basically Sauron's downfall. It was his fear and his pride. Had he been able to swallow those and face the Valar, he actually would have gotten clemency. I mean, if they're willing to forgive Morgoth the first time around and give him a second chance, Sauron would most definitely have been given a second chance, or at the very least, he wouldn't have been thrown into the void like Morgoth was. But Sauron didn't understand any of that. It was, again, his pride and his fear that led to his ultimate downfall. So Sauron then spent many, many years in the dark plotting his revenge. He was going to conquer all of Middle-earth and then raise a mighty empire and army to get his revenge on the Valar. This is why, many centuries later, Sauron appeared as Annatar the Gift Giver in Eregion, and why he communed with Celebrimbor. Now we get to ring lore, and this is something that this episode just absolutely sucked at doing. The rings aren't just simply, ooh, cool metals made from mithril. No! I mean, they've already gotten mithril absolutely wrong. They misused the Silmarils. It's so horrible. And again, we see that here. And they try to make it seem all cool, like we need something precious and holy, like gold and silver from Valinor. Galadriel, we need your knife. And this whole thing is supposed to be Galadriel giving up her revenge in order to help the elves. No, Galadriel's actually not giving up her revenge by giving up Finrod's dagger. She is using Finrod's dagger to help create the rings by which she hopes to still get her revenge on Sauron. So Galadriel's still completely motivated by revenge by the end of Season 1. Her character has not developed at all. But the rings themselves were made of all different kinds of metals. They were made through the use of powerful magic. Sauron was the true originator of this particular craft, though Celebrimbor did do his own stuff. This is one of the reasons why, when it comes to the 3 elven rings, he had made them without Sauron's advice or direct help. And that is why the 3 elven rings are untainted by Sauron's magic. However, all of the rings of power, from the 1 ring to the 3 to the 7 for the dwarves to the 9 for men, and all of the lesser rings, all of those were made using Sauron's knowledge. When Sauron is defeated at the end of the Lord of the Rings, all of that power is destroyed, and that is why all of the rings, including the 3 elven rings, which are untainted, will fade and cause the elves to have to leave Middle-earth. This ties ultimately into Sauron's master plan, which was to control all the races of Middle-earth using the rings. Now, the rings themselves were forged in all different kinds of Now, the rings themselves were forged in a curious way. Tolkien doesn't go into any great detail about how they were made, but when we look at how magic is used in Middle-earth, we can tell very clearly that it's not just simply make metal, blended with mithril. No, in order to create very powerful magical items, there is will, there is intent, very likely there is song involved, there is the very essence of soul being put into this. And with that kind of ethereal awesomeness, just like imagine the smiths of Eregion just singing as they're pounding away on rings. We get to see just some really cool stuff with like soul going into the rings, or they're bending fate and will and power. Like, that would have been really cool. Instead, we just get fantasy metalwork, and it was nowhere near as cool as really any of the forging of the rings should have been. And another thing to kind of bring up right here, Sauron talks about the One. Who is the One? The One is Iluvatar, but because they never really bring him up and they're talking about the gods, the Valar, they're already screwing up the whole idea of Pantheon, of the Pantheon of Middle-earth, the faith of Middle-earth, and all of this kind of stuff. So even the cheap reference to Iluvatar, that was really dumb. It was starting to be like, oh, I could finally feel my connection to the One. Look, everyone, all of creation is connected to Iluvatar because they are his creations. From the Valar down to the most humble of hobbits, even the orcs, they have some sort of connection to him because he is the god of everything. So again, this show kind of misunderstands what Tolkien was doing with his mythology. He said it was very Christian. He borrowed heavily from his own personal beliefs. Right here, as the show meanders around in the essence of religion, they make all of these mistakes that if you were someone who didn't know any of the lore of Middle-earth and you tried to basically piece together who on earth the Valar are, what is the One, how does faith or magic work, you would find so many inconsistencies in the Rings of Power. It doesn't make any sense, and that's what happens when you don't go back to the books, when you don't rely on the established canon. And let's quickly get back to Galadriel. We've talked about this before, and so many other people have talked about this, that this is obviously not the Galadriel that Tolkien wrote. But not only that, like, the whole concept of revenge within Middle-earth, oh my gosh, if you were actually to see a character who's hell-bent on revenge, which would be Turin-Turambar, Tolkien wrote him way better than they wrote Galadriel in this. And I don't like Turin-Turambar personally. I really don't like his story. I don't like his character. And yet, Tolkien wrote a better revenge story for Turin-Turambar than these guys have written for Galadriel, because revenge is not only consistent, but it's something that grows and develops. When we look at the character of Turin-Turambar, there are many things that he eventually goes to claim revenge for. And it's really interesting because, well, spoilers, he marries his sister. When he goes to get revenge on Glaurung, it's actually for his wife, because he's married to his sister. He's getting revenge for his sister, whom he presumes is dead. And when the truth is revealed to him that, no, you married your sister, he's like, well, then I'm getting revenge for my sister and my wife. Because, you know what? He realizes things have changed. This is a moment that doesn't break him, though it leads eventually to his suicide, but he's like, you know what? Screw you, dragon. This is for everyone. This is for who I am, for who I've become, for who I was as a child, for what you did to my family, and for who I've become as a man and the people around me that you have hurt. You compare that to Galadriel in the Rings of Power, who once again has shown no character development whatsoever. And another thing to address as far as lore inaccuracies go, I made a joke about how there's all this information that just seems to be at their fingertips. It's like the internet in a library, which you can find the internet at your local library. You should go to your local library more often. But Galadriel is a being of just intense wisdom, and there are plenty of lore masters all throughout Middle-earth. The Council of Elrond is full of them, and there are others besides. So where are these lore masters who are helping out all of our main characters? Why is Elrond not a lore master? Why is Celebrimbor not a lore master? Why is Gil-galad not a lore master? Why is Galadriel not a lore master? Where on earth are all of the lore masters? You obviously have all of this information, but it seems like no one has that up there in their heads or at their obvious fingertips. No, we have to go find a Vulcan, or we have to go find some old dude who will just magically find whatever we want for whatever circumstance. This is dumb, and it definitely takes away from very intelligent characters within the canon. And let's talk about Gandalf right here. This was aggravating to see, because it again robs a character of their backstory, who they are. It's very important. Tolkien wrote that when the Astari were chosen by the Valar to go to Middle-earth, it was very intentional, because they realized that Sauron was gaining power, and that with the elves diminishing in strength, and with the dwarves also diminishing in population, mankind alone would not be enough to defend the world against Sauron, especially with the Númenórean blood becoming weaker with each successive generation. Sauron would win, and they could peer from afar what his grand plans were, and they realized he spent those years in isolation very, very well, crafting the perfect plan for revenge, all the way back in the Second Age. And even though he was defeated at the end of the Second Age, coming back in the Third Age, Sauron will win. That is inevitable unless somehow the One Ring could be destroyed. But in order to find a way in which the One Ring could be destroyed against all odds that Sauron had made, they needed to have specialized agents go to Middle-earth. Now, the Valar could not come themselves because of the deal they had made with the Ilúvatar at the end, towards the end of the Second Age, when Númenor betrayed the Valar and attempted to invade Valinor. What this means now, since the Valar gave all of the dominion of the earth back over to Ilúvatar, they cannot directly get involved, nor can any of their agents necessarily get fully directly involved. Rather, they shouldn't, because that could lead to all kinds of problems. So the Astari, 5 main wizards, and possibly there are other wizards, but 5 in particular, were sent as special agents to Middle-earth to prepare the people of Middle-earth against Sauron and discover a means by which the One Ring could be destroyed. Gandalf, back in Valinor, was one of the Lesser Maiar, and he was terrified of confronting Sauron. Saruman, on the other hand, was desirous to take on this role and become the leader of the Astari and take the war directly to Sauron himself. Gandalf, however, was favored to be the leader of the Astari, which Sauron never forgave him for, nor ever forgot, and always held that against Gandalf, which caused darkness to already brew within Saruman, which Galadriel noticed, and she always kept Saruman at bay after the Astari came to Middle-earth. Well, Gandalf was eventually talked into going to Middle-earth to help the other wizards defeat Sauron. And so this is a journey for Gandalf. Gandalf has to overcome his doubts, his insecurity, his cowardice to become a hero, which he absolutely does. And he doesn't see it within himself, though the Valar do. And also Círdan the shipwright sees it. So when Gandalf arrives on Middle-earth through the Grey Havens, Círdan takes Gandalf aside and actually gives to him one of the 3 elven rings, saying, I foresee many dark places and many dark events in your future. Should you need greater power, this ring will give it to you. And Gandalf then wields that power of the elves in order to help him accomplish all of his many deeds. He's not just a powerful Maiar and wizard, he is a wizard who is wielding one of the 3 elven rings. And this just makes Gandalf all the more fascinating and all the more interesting. If you rob him of that and just say he fell from the sky and boom, here he is, and now he has to figure out who he is, well, what about him willfully coming to Earth with the rest of the Astari? What about the rivalry between him and Saruman? What about him receiving the ring from Círdan, who's able to see into his soul and realize this Maiar is going to need this power, and I can foresee why he needs it. That is really, really cool. And plus, that's a great friendship between Gandalf and Círdan, and it sets up so many great relationships throughout the Third Age. All of that has been robbed by having Gandalf show up in this way. And on top of that, this is just dumb, because this is not how the Valar work. That's just stupid. And neither would Ilúvatar work that way. Everything is done with purpose. If there's any spectacle, the spectacle is part of the purpose. Why drop Gandalf in the middle of somewhere? And, ooh, no, it's a mystery box, Lars. We're going to figure out why this all happened. That's just stupid, because I guarantee, based on the track record of this season, that the showrunners cannot come up with a better reason or story for Gandalf to arrive on Middle-earth than what Tolkien already created, which set up so many important things within the Third Age that tie directly into the Lord of the Rings. These showrunners have obliterated all of that by having Gandalf show up in this manner and then be mistaken for Sauron? No, that's just dumb. And then on top of that, these proto-wraiths, now that I actually do like the idea, because Sauron definitely corrupted many different spirits. He brought all kinds of horrors and abominations to him, which is actually really cool. So having them appear as these 3 cultists is actually kind of dumb. And on top of that, wraiths can't take on human form like that. They have to actually take, basically, they either have to take suits of armor or corpses and reanimate them. That's what we see with the ring wraiths, and that's what we see in the Barrow Downs with the Barrow Wights. So again, the showrunners have no idea what they're dealing with when it comes to these various beings, from Sauron to Galadriel to Celebrimbor and his amazing smiths, with his amazing smithies and his smiths and his power, his knowledge. These people do not understand Gandalf in any kind of way. They don't even understand the ring wraiths or the wights. So in that sense, like I said, they basically took the corpse of Tolkien and stitched it on however they felt in a way, in order to try to make this look amazing. But you see, there's a problem. There's a reason why I describe this as taking a corpse and stitching it on, because it's still a corpse. It's a mockery. It's decaying. It's degrading. It's disgusting. That's what all of this is. None of this, from a lore standpoint, makes any sense, and it should be rejected as such. The Rings of Power, as of episode 8, has put the final nail in the coffin. From this point onwards, no matter what they say about seasons 2, 3, 4, or 5, there is nothing truly canonical about this show. nothing. Even the things they got right, they ended up destroying by wrecking so much of the lore. It really is, wholly and truly, its own story. Alright, so dialing things back just a little bit here. What was Tolkien trying to do with this story? What was he attempting to do with writing what he did? Let's have a look at Sauron. I think it's very important to note right here that Sauron is yet another type of Lucifer, a beautiful, powerful, angelic being who fell due to his pride. Pride goeth before the fall, and that is exactly what we see here with Sauron. There was once a moment where Sauron could have redeemed himself. In fact, there's actually probably a few, but Sauron rejected all of them out of his fear and his pride. His pride that he was indeed powerful, that he was right, or that things were going to be done his way. He was going to find redemption his way, which, when we tap into Tolkien's Christian background, that's a very significant difference between Jesus and Lucifer. Jesus giving up his will to the Father, Lucifer going against the will of the Father, seeking his own means for redemption or for the children of men. Whichever way you wish to look at it. But it all still comes back down to pride, and Sauron embodies that. There are plenty of great stories out there of characters who fell to their own pride, but with Sauron, it's pretty poignant because he's quite literally an angel. This is all falling in line with Tolkien's personal beliefs. And let's then have a look at the characters. Why has Tolkien written so many of the characters the way that he did? Looking at Celebrimbor, this fantastically knowledgeable, skilled elf who, when we go back to the books, unlike J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, he wasn't seeking to craft something that would rival his grandfather Feanor and cement his legacy into the immortality of Middle-earth. No, Celebrimbor did everything they did because he cared about his fellow elves, and he loved them. He loved Galadriel, and not just platonically. He wanted to have a romantic relationship with her, but she was married to Lord Celeborn. And so Celebrimbor's like, hey, you know what? I totally respect that, but out of my love for you, I'm going to do everything I can in order to ensure the beauty and preservation of Middle-earth and all the things in it that you personally love, Galadriel. And that's exactly what he did. And while Celebrimbor did work for a time with Annatar, he was not corruptible. The moment that he realized that Sauron had betrayed him, Eregion shut its doors to Annatar, aka Sauron, and fought against him. And Celebrimbor fought to the very last to defeat Sauron, but gave his life in doing so. So Celebrimbor, a really great man, and his story is tragic because he was a good man doing good things for the right reasons, but he had invited evil into his life in order to obtain those good things, which, I mean, he didn't exactly know, and this is once again analogous of the temptations of the adversary, who Sauron represents. We then look at a character like Gandalf. Gandalf, who we read and see just this amazing hero, this wise old man who loves the world, he loves the hobbits, he does so much to save other people, he's willing to sacrifice himself to save others, and he still takes up the call to beat death and come back to turn the tides against Sauron. He is a hero, and yet he didn't start out that way. He started off as someone who was scared, someone who didn't believe in himself, someone who passed the torch along to someone like Saruman, which again sets up all different kinds of crazy dynamics for later on. But Gandalf grows up. He becomes the hero. Can you really tell me anyone within Rings of Power who truly rises to become the hero? Not really. But Gandalf does that, and that is really, really awesome. Tolkien understood religion. Tolkien understood symbolism. Tolkien understood the hero's journey. And while he said that he was not a fan of analogy, that doesn't mean that he wasn't putting something very poignant and meaningful into his stories. The epicness that we crave, the battle, the everlasting battle between good and evil, and showing that even the smallest person can change the course of the future, and that not all heroes are born, but are made, that anyone can rise or fall along their journey. These are all things that are very human to us. Regardless of where we come from or what our personal beliefs are, we see all of these things playing out in our daily lives. Tolkien took those things and wove it into the fabric of epic fantasy and epic poetry, stuff that he knew very, very well. And as such, that is how he was able to create a modern myth, a story that has withstood the test of time, even though, granted, his story hasn't been around for centuries like Beowulf or the Iliad or so forth. However, we can be pretty sure that his stories will stick around for a very long time to come and continue to impress future generations because he tapped into truly timeless qualities. Millions of stories have come and gone, but very few have become myth, and that is exactly what Tolkien wrote. Alright, now let's come to the part of this video where I discuss the Rings of Power as if Tolkien had never existed, as though his myth had never been written. How does this story stand on its own merit? Well, to be all honest, if I hadn't known anything about Tolkien, if Tolkien never existed, if his lore never existed, this episode of the Rings of Power would have been the best episode thus far. Why? Because finally things are all coming together. We get the reveal about Sauron, we get the Rings of Power finally forged. Hey, the show's finally living up to its name, and we get to see some pretty interesting things happen. And there's good chemistry between a lot of these characters. It was an engaging episode for the most part to watch. However, there are obviously, again, many issues with this being a first draft show. One of the things being is this: I didn't feel betrayed with Halbrand being revealed as Sauron. Part of the reason for this is that we've had 7 episodes, actually less. We've had less than 7 episodes to get to know Halbrand, and Halbrand only featured in fragments of those episodes. As such, we couldn't really get to know him really as a character. We get to know some of his motivations, but what really is his personality? What is the fake history that he made? How would he have been as a real leader or ruler? There's so much potential that could have been had with Halbrand should you have used him for yet another season as just simply Halbrand before revealing him to be Sauron. Actually show him developing good, healthy relationships with lots of characters. So that way when the betrayal comes, it actually hurts. The showrunners talked about this as being, this is Batman Begins, and now we're going to lead to the Dark Knight. This is like Walter White, becoming the villain. No, it isn't. For one thing, talking about Batman Begins and then later on the Dark Knight, that's something very, very different. Batman doesn't become the villain. That's not how that works. 2 very different stories right there. And the story of Walter White is yet another one entirely because we are made to feel very sympathetic for Walter White as a character from the very beginning as we see him struggle with all of the revelations that are given to him, the way that life treats him and so forth before he starts becoming a drug dealer. With Halbrand, we didn't get really much to sympathize with other than that, dude, we sympathize that you have to put up with Galadriel because she sucks. Other than that, there's no reason really to truly sympathize with him. I know a lot of people liked his character, they liked the actor, and they wanted more of that, which should have been given to us again before the reveal and the betrayal. It all happened really quickly. And on top of that, it kind of just comes out of nowhere because Galadriel just hears something and suddenly starts piecing things together, again like a Mary Sue. And yes, she still is a Mary Sue within this episode. Sure, Sauron escapes from her, but she is able to throw off the temptations of Sauron. She gets all the information she needs exactly when she wants it. And the rings are made according to what she has said. And what she has said about the rings is kind of dumb. That they need to have 3 for balance? Okay then, talking as a red-blooded American, someone who's like, yes, I love America and it's a wonderful government system. Look here, the whole idea of checks and balances, that is a tenuous situation at best. It doesn't always work. That's politics right here. Now then, the rings are effectively being treated as politics. And as we learn from looking at history, the more power that you break up around to more people, this doesn't necessarily mean unity or checks or balances. It just now means that there's more people who are competing for that power. The 3 rings, well, that's something actually significant and religious. Again, it is religious numerology, iconography right here, which the showrunners kind of missed out on. The more people that you give almighty power to, that means more competition. Now, Galadriel does have a point. 1 ring means that 1 person will rule over all of them. So, unless you have a completely benevolent king or queen, you probably don't want to give that person all their power. Now, when we look at the people who are there to rule the elves, All of them suck. Celebrimbor is a guy who I wouldn't even really trust to choose my jewelry or my wardrobe. Elrond constantly is going back on his word. Galadriel is filled with bloodlust and revenge, and King Gil-galad is a wimp and a liar. So yeah, there's no elf so far in Middle-earth who's been shown to be a leader who I would actually entrust any of these rings to. And that's a big problem here within this show. And again, these rings are being forged not just to save the elves, but on Galadriel's part to spite Sauron. She put her brother's blade into the mix, not just to help make the rings, which is dumb because Mithril doesn't need to be put together with other holier metals. No, in fact, I should have included that earlier. Mithril can be included and blended in with all other kinds of metals to create cool stuff, like ethylene, which is the cool reflective metal that reflects only starlight and moonlight, which is put into the Wall of Moria. In any case, moving on, again, it's all just to spite Sauron. Galadriel has not grown as a character at all, and this episode confirms that she is the villain while still saying that no, she is the hero and the bestest ever. This is completely contradictory. What am I supposed to think about this character? The show is telling me one thing, but I'm also seeing something completely different. And the showrunners are like, what you think you saw is not what you think you saw, which is what every villain likes to say. So I think the showrunners are the real villains here. Galadriel is obviously an evil character, and yet she's going to be bestowed with a ring of power because she's wise? No, she's not. She's a Mary Sue, which is why she's going to be getting this ring. And that's just dumb because it once again reinforces a Mary Sue character, and it's only been to the detriment of the overall story. Now, I did like the chemistry between Halbrand/Sauron and Celebrimbor. That was really good. I would have liked to have seen more interactions between Halbrand and Elrond. I would have liked to have seen Gil-galad not be a douchebag. There was a lot of potential here in this episode, which again wasn't tapped into, and that is a hallmark of a first draft. There are all kinds of beautiful gems hidden within a rough draft, but they're encased in muck. The editing process allows you to break up all of that garbage, take out the good stuff, and then embellish it with even more good stuff. That's how a second draft is supposed to run. But alas, these guys have not done any of that. They're just going full steam ahead with whatever first draft story they wrote. And I do not expect season 2 to get any better. And yeah, that's just what I see right here. This entire season is wasted potential. There are good things here. And if you don't know anything about Tolkien or the lore, it can be enjoyable. But even then, there's a lot of people I've come across who've just kind of grown disinterested. The best I've heard from anyone who has actually stuck out the show was that they said they could turn their brain off to it. They weren't even paying attention. It was just something nice to look at out of the corner of their eye. That is kind of damning praise, if we're being all honest here. So yeah, the Rings of Power is a bust. I'm going to be going into more detail in an upcoming video about what kinds of good advice we can pull out of the entire season as a whole. But from this episode, what are some things that novice authors could actually learn from and benefit from? Well, there are a few things. Number one, this is something I think that's really big, is that having these little subplots, like the stuff with Nori and Gandalf and the stuff with the Númenóreans, it's interesting and it helps to show just how big this world has become and how big it is. But the problem is that you can very easily encumber the overall flow of the story by constantly jumping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes it can actually be very good to drop those little subplots entirely or to put them into an adjacent story. This is something that a lot of people who are writing big stories and big series do, is that they are like, hey, you know what? Here we have the main line of books. There are these very interesting characters who you see in the background. I'm going to give you a book dedicated solely to them, so that way things continue to flow well. That is something that could have been done here. You could have easily have made the whole Harfoot adventure its own side movie. Heck, like if you had done the show focusing on just kind of the main characters who play in and around the story of the rings and really flesh out their stories, and then done the Harfoot stuff as like an interim movie to help tide people over to season 2, that would have been a good idea, but they didn't do that. Another key bit of advice is this: if you are going to deal with large time skips or lots of travel, look, you do not need to have the phases of the moon like what Tolkien wrote, but you need to take into account speed, time for travel, distances, all those things. How many days does it take to get from point A to point B? And be consistent about it. This show makes it says like Middle-earth is huge and vast, and yet it takes 6 days for Galadriel to ride by horse halfway across the world. It takes 1 day to sail 200 miles? Wow, wouldn't we love to have that kind of technology today for our ships? This stuff just breaks the immersion because it goes against what we know to be true. Yes, this is a fantasy story, but if it just gets that fantastical in a way that it completely grinds against what we know to be real, it breaks that immersion. You need to stay consistent with time, distance, and speed. Another good bit of advice I think all authors can take out of this is that if you're going to have a reveal for a character, whether it be a betrayal, or they reveal their true identity, or they reveal the thing that they were actually after all along, what have you, it's some sort of twist, we need to truly get to know that character for a fair amount of time. We need to feel like we actually understand them before you pull that twist. We didn't have enough time to really get to know Halbrand. And true, yes, spoilers had already spoiled what the reveal was going to be, who was actually Sauron, and even for those who didn't hear the spoilers, well, the show really telegraphed who Sauron was all this time. So, yeah. The thing is that it's okay to have those little breadcrumbs that help people to make sense of a certain twist or reveal, but again, we need to have adequate time with certain characters to fully take in who they are before the twist changes the entire paradigm, and then we have to reevaluate who this person or who these people are. And yes, it actually can be done in a pretty brief span of time, but that then requires that you do excellent character writing. A good example of this, and I'm not going to give away who the traitor is in the book Beyonders. There is a traitor who arrives within the story that maybe you see it coming, maybe you don't. I didn't see it coming, and yet it made absolute sense once the reveal and twist came. And it hurt because in that short amount of time, we only get this character for a brief amount of time, that character was very full of life. You felt like you understood them from like the second page after we get to know them. And a lot of that character comes through, and it was fantastic. It was great to feel like I got to know this character before I got the knife in the back. And that's what you want right here. Halbrand was again not given enough time to really develop as a character. And the same thing also applies to when you want to tug at the heartstrings for character death. Sadoc Burrows could have had a very emotional end. The thing is that he spent most of the season as an absolute jerk, and only in the penultimate episode really begins to turn around as an individual. That's not enough time for him to go through a redemption arc, so that way when he dies, we feel hurt. Now then, you can kill a character before they obtain total redemption. It has been done in other stories, but we still had time to get to know them in their attempt to redeem themselves. So that way it hurt because we're like, oh my gosh, no, they were becoming better. Ah! There's a really cool scene like that in the Stormlight Archive. It's one that still the fans of the Stormlight Archive are ticked off about. And I'm not going to spoil again what that moment is like. Definitely read the Stormlight Archive so that way you too can feel the rage that so many of us feel in regards to one particular character. So yeah, developing good characters is all about time. You need time to develop them within the story, and you need to allow the audience to have time to feel like they get to know them. Otherwise, your twists, your reveals, your murders will not land with the emotional weight that you want them to. So, that right there, that is kind of my parting advice. I mean, I could get into all other kinds of details about like how you can make scenes look really cool and whatnot, like how the Forging of the Rings should have been, but that really comes down to a story-by-story basis. Especially if you're dealing with magic or with cool science fiction technology, you want to make sure that you really give spectacle, but also logical reasoning within in the world building that you have provided. Those two things coming together marry into an epic scene that makes sense and blows people away. None of that was there for The Forging of the Rings. In fact, I kind of had to stop. I actually rewound and went back through it, and I was like, oh, it is as underwhelming as I first thought. And that's really, really sad when it should have been great. But again, that goes from a story-by-story basis, depending on what you do. And even a very simplistic story can still have a really epic moment in it, again, if you marry spectacle with what is logical within that story's framework. All right, so I think that's enough advice right there, enough review and analysis. Whew. Man, I can't wait to just simply close the door on this particular chapter in our adventure that we call writing, but there is still a whole lot more to do. If you are someone who is actively looking to write your own story and is looking for good writing advice, please feel free to check out our other videos here on YouTube. We also have our podcast episodes found on Podbean, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, the works, where you get to hear the entire harem diving into way more advice and experience to help you become a better author. We also have writing exercises for you to check out over at our Pinterest page, and of course, you can always join our growing community of novice authors. Links for all of that and more are down in the description below. And until the next video, y'all, let's actually enjoy some real epic fantasy. Go back, reread Tolkien's Middle-earth, or watch the Peter Jackson films. Those will be highly rewarding. You can also check out my 5 recommendations from the beginning of the video. There's a lot of good stuff to read, a lot of good stuff to write. Go out and do it, and tschüss.